1 Corinthians chapter 3 is so commonly misapplied. In it, Paul talks about a man's work being tested by fire by the day, and certain aspects of his work stand the trials, the fire, so to speak, and some do not, and that he loses or gains reward based upon this. But he himself is saved also in the end, though, even with the loss of his work, although he's tested himself by fire. So commonly, by devotionals and by others, this is applied to a Christian's life, how he lives his life. That he lives his life in a certain way, that certain parts of it, certain achievements that he makes or things that he constructs in his life, figuratively speaking, are of good quality and some are not. And he gains or loses rewards in eternity based upon these things. But he's still saved in the end himself. Furthermore, some people apply it to once saved, always saved, that a man may become a Christian and then ultimately live his life in a bad way, maybe even live in sin, die in sin, and lose rewards in eternity that he might have otherwise have had, but he himself is still saved. It's very often applied to once saved, always saved. But the text is not about that at all. It is not about these things. Paul is not talking about a Christian's life. Paul is talking about ministers establishing churches. That's the work of a man that he's talking about. And the reason the man can be saved, the loss of his work, is because although the people that he establishes do not make it in the end, but he himself is going to undergo testing himself for his own testing. Now, but we're going to look at this. One of the problems is that Christianity is a very Bible illiterate community. We're supposed to be a Bible-based community, but very few people know the Bible very well. Now, granted, there's a lot in the Bible. I'm still studying it and learning myself, and there are difficult portions of it. So most of the most important things are not all that difficult. But one does not have to be a Bible scholar. But so often is the case, people are very familiar with verses or passages, but not about the context in which they appear. And this is a big problem with devotionals. Now, devotionals can be good. Devotionals can be a good thing. But the problem is that devotionals will often present verses without discussing the context, the historical background of it, and misapply it. And people become familiar with a devotional's, the principles of life from verses, when the verses actually don't have anything to do with that. Now, oftentimes the principles or the lessons applied from the verse are still good and still true, but not what the verse is talking about. So, that's a shame. But let's look at this. Now, in chapter 1, here's what you got to know. In chapter 1, Paul discusses the divisions that are occurring in the Corinthian church. They were dividing over certain teachers. Cephas, Apollos, and Paul are named. And some were saying, I am of Peter. Some were saying, I am of Apollos, or I am of Paul. I am of Paul. And Paul rebukes them, saying, hey, Paul wasn't crucified for you. You were not baptized in the name of Paul. And he seemingly gets off on the subject of worldly wisdom versus the wisdom of God, and that's not unrelated. It has very much to do with the appeal of Apollos. But in chapter 3, he begins to talk once again about the divisive mindset that they had. But he focuses on himself and Apollos. Okay, now, he says, and I, brothers, was not able to speak to you as spiritual men. He's talking about a time in the past. Evidently, Apollos, and there's no rebuke of Apollos here. It's a rebuke of them. And it should be noted, by the way, that there's no indication, and to the contrary, that either Cephas, Peter, Paul himself, who's writing this, and Apollos were disagreeing. There's no indication of that at all. That they were preaching different things, there's no indication of that. In fact, Paul would have rebuked any error that they would have been teaching. He does in other places, not these men per se. Well, he does rebuke some bad behavior from Peter in Galatians. But nevertheless, the idea is just that the Corinthians themselves were dividing over these three faithful men. But and evidently Apollos got into some deeper things about the gospel that they appreciated, and they were saying that Paul simply did not. Why didn't Paul do this when Paul established the church? So Apollos and Cephas were ministers just like Paul. I should have said this earlier, but Paul established the Corinthian church. But then as he would travel on, others would come and teach and work among the church too. Apollos did this. This is how it happens today. And evidently they were kind of like, hey, Apollos gets into some deeper and more interesting stuff than Paul. But Paul is here saying, I didn't come to you like you were spiritual men. You weren't able to handle deeper things. As infants in Christ, I gave you milk to drink, not solid food, for you were not able to receive it. Indeed, even now, you are still not even able. For you are still fleshly. You are worldly minded. You're not able to move beyond the basics at this point. For since there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not fleshly? Are you not walking like mere men? For when one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not mere men? He's saying these divisions you have over ministers, you haven't matured yet in Christ if you're doing this kind of thing. What then is Apollos? Now here we're going to get into the section that is so often misapplied. What then is Apollos? And what is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to each one. So what he's saying is, hey, we're just servants. So as he rebuked them in chapter 1 and here for having these divisions over ministers, he's saying you're putting the emphasis on the servant rather than the person who served. That's God. That's Christ. We're just servants. I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. Now what he's talking about here is evangelism and minister work. Now when he says I planted, he's saying I established the church. Sure enough, Corinthians. He came, you could read about this in Acts 19. You read through 18, 19, 20, read the full context there. But so he came to Corinth, preached the gospel, and converted people to Christ and established this church. Later he traveled on. Apollos would come and work among them, strengthening them. So he watered. So the analogy at this point from Paul is of planting. You plant fruit or a crop or a vineyard maybe. That's the comparison to establishing a church. You plant a church. Paul comes and waters the garden, so to speak, the vineyard or whatever. He gives that which is necessary for growth. But it's God that does the growing. God causes the growth. You could water all day long in a garden, and oftentimes are not successful. But God is the one who has to cause the maturity of the plant, the growth. So what he's saying is, you hadn't grown when I was speaking to you. But notice that's the comparison, so to speak. It's now the church versus the minister. We're not into anything yet about a Christian and his life. He says, so then, in verse 7, the one who plants, nor the one who waters is anything. You're putting the wrong emphasis on us. Put it on God, not the minister, but God who causes the growth. Now, he who plants and he who waters are one. There is unity among Apollos and Paul. This has nothing to do with different people preaching different things. He's not addressing that issue. Paul and Apollos were both ministers of the same gospel. He's saying, yeah, we're in unity here. He who plants and he who waters are one, but each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. Yeah, so there's different amounts of work that ministers bring. So he's saying it is true that Apollos and I work in different ways. I'm not talking about the content, not talking about the message preached, although how you preach it and what degree you preach it, all of that will factor into how a person ministers and teaches and builds upon a church. So he's saying, yeah, there is a difference between he and I. We do different things in different ways, and we will receive our own reward. It's true. Individual Christians, in this case ministers, get different rewards in eternity for their work. For we are God's fellow workers. We who? Ministers. evangelist. You are God's field, God's building. So once again, notice the you here is going to be plural. You, the church, are God's field. This is still keeping with the gardening analogy. But then he adds another analogy, God's building. This is a common one, where the church is called a temple, a house of God in the New Testament. And so now he focuses on this analogy. It's the same, it's making the same point, but a different analogy. According to the grace of God which is given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation. This is establishing a church. You don't get any building established without a foundation. When a person has laid a foundation, he's established a building, although it might be in development. And this is establishing a church. This is going into an area where there is no Christianity, or perhaps where there might be Christianity, but you're taking people who themselves aren't Christians and you're converting them and establishing a church there, a church of the Lord. So I laid a foundation, keeping with the building analogy, and another is building on it. It's the same idea of Apollos. Another minister comes and develops the church on top of the foundation that was laid. But each man must be careful how he builds on it. So he's saying that, yeah, he and I work in different ways, but every man must be careful. Now, already we can see, it's very easy to see, this is not about a Christian's life individually. For no one can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid. With you Corinthians, he's saying, which is Jesus Christ. In other words, there's only one foundation. It's not like you could do it again. You would have to do if you lay a foundation, you've laid a different one. That's the idea. You must build upon, if the foundation is good, in this case it was when Paul established it, then all you could do is build upon it. But you must be careful that you don't end up laying another kind of foundation, even inadvertently, because then you got something else than the church. He's saying it's not the Lord's house at that moment. In other words, if a person has laid a proper foundation, if another minister comes along, he's not careful, he's going to end up laying some other kind of building, some other kind of foundation, and not the proper one. Now, he's talking about ministers, and he says, now if any one of a minister, of evangelist, or a worker builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident. Now, you got metal that survives and can hold up fire, which he's going to mention here, and material that cannot. What he's saying is the kind of material that one builds upon a foundation, whether it is true material, whether it is material that can withstand testing and trial, is going to be revealed eventually. For the day will indicate it. I take that to mean over the course of the day, or the day itself being used as a comparison to the trial and testing that will be applied to the material. You know, throughout the day, weather hits upon a building, and the kind of building that it is will be shown to be what it is. You know, if weather hits a house, if it's got, you know, stronger parts are going to withstand easier than, say, vinyl siding, or perhaps windows will break easy. Now, you may be asking, okay, so what does this all mean? What's being compared to? What's the analogy about at this point? We'll talk about that. So each man's work will become evident, for the day will indicate it, because it is revealed with fire. I take that to be testing. Fire set to a building, if parts remain, and most buildings in this time were made of, the structure of it was concrete, so some of it would still be left standing. Our houses, generally, there's nothing left, because we build with primarily wood. And the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. The quality of each man's work. Each man in this case is a minister, and the work is the church. What it's saying is, if you end up building another foundation, or if you go to the same foundation, but you end up bringing either, in this case, parts of the content of your message that are not actually a part of the gospel, or you teach in such a way as to get people's emphasis on the wrong things. Perhaps you mix the gospel in with a lot of fancy human wisdom, And what you're going to end up doing is having a lot of false converts, a lot of Christians who are not well-rooted, very knowledgeable. And what happens is over time, they, being tested, will either fall away or not. And it is the case so often that people establish churches that are not true churches, that people in them, if they're a Christian at all, have bought into a lot of false ideas. So, false teaching and the content of the message surely can be significant here. In Apollos' case, it was probably that he was bringing in so much fancy rhetoric and philosophy, although not necessarily teaching false doctrine, but it was causing them to be overly infatuated with rhetorical skills and philosophy. Now, earlier in chapter 2 and verse 1, Paul does make mention about himself, saying, "When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with superiority of word or of wisdom." In other words, I wasn't some great speaker, maybe like Apollos, and I wasn't all that impressive, but you didn't need that kind of thing. So even having truth, a person can still, how he presents it, establish weak Christians or false Christians. A lot of churches are built upon gimmicks. A lot of people, I don't like drawing people to Christ with gimmicks. People will have a scrummage or maybe a yard. Church will have a yard sale, or it'll throw a feast for the community. And when people come, then they will teach the gospel. Well, people are coming for food, and you're trying to hook them in so that you can then preach the gospel. Now, I realize, I'll save my thoughts on that. But the problem is when people were looking for Jesus because of how well he fed them, he rebuked them. If you're trying to draw a crowd with gimmicks like food, or I read about a church one day in the newspaper that it was going to have a bodybuilder come and do tricks with steel rods and bend them, and he was going to teach them about the gospel. That's a gimmick. You're drawing a crowd with something other than the gospel in order to try to spring the gospel on them, so to speak. You're baiting them. What you're going to end up with, if people stay, is because they're probably going to expect more of the same kind of show and entertainment. A lot of people are attracted to churches because of how entertaining or cool they are. And a church doesn't have to be boring. But what happens is maybe the man moves, or the church isn't there anymore. And then those things that he was attracted to go away, and he's gone because it wasn't Christ that kept him there. Another problem today is the prosperity gospel, the health and wealth gospel. This attracts millions upon millions of people. Joel Osteen, all the TBN crew. And what happens is people are really there and a part of this Christianity because of the promise of material blessing. They're false converts. But so these things kind of happen. Now, with Apollos, there isn't any indication of false teaching, but the implication seems to be that his rhetorical skills and maybe some of the fancy philosophy that he brought into it was not good for the Corinthians where they were. They were a Greek culture. Greek culture loved philosophy, and it kind of was getting them on the wrong track. So he says, a man's work, you're infatuated with Apollos, he's saying. And so you're saying that Apollos did great work there, and you seem to be very zealous now. So Apollos has been doing great work. Has he? And he might have been, but where are you with these divisions? The testing, in this case, just as life plays out, it shows that you're still not that strong. You're still infants. And so it says, if any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. A man is rewarded for his work in the kingdom. If the church is no longer there because of their weakness, or maybe they were false converts, or because he just didn't build strong material, so to speak, he's not going to get a reward for that, of course. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved. Now, this is where they get once saved, always saved. They say, well, a Christian's life may not be very good, but he himself is still going to be saved. No, this is talking about the work that a minister builds or creates. He himself is going to be tried just like the Christians or the converts that he has. Or the, in this case, they weren't Apollos' converts. There may have been some, though. Yet so as through fire, he himself will undergo the same principles. Do you not know that you, that's plural you, the Greek does tell us if it's singular or plural, English does not, are a sanctuary of God, and this is talking about the church. The church is the sanctuary of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you. If any man destroys the sanctuary of God, that's the church, God will destroy him. For the sanctuary of God is holy, and that is what you are. Now, he could be talking about still how the evangelists and ministers themselves should be careful how they work, because they may cause damage actually to God's church. But I think he's, at this point, turning the rebuke back to them. The way they are behaving as Christians are bringing damage to God's church. Okay, and then he goes on. But so it's very clear, once you follow the line of reasoning, that this has nothing to do with a Christian's life. I do believe Christians receive rewards, but obviously if you live your life in rebellion, there is no one saved, always saved. And this certainly doesn't apply to it at all. Anyway, so having gone through that, I hope that that helps. Food for thought, something to think about.